Hello, everyone, and welcome. I like to have three words for all of you. Good morning. My name is Miles Yu. I am a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute, and I'm also the director of Hudson Institute's China Center, which has the honor and privilege to host today's event. We're here today to talk about the very hot topic about the very cold region of the world. That region, of course, is the Arctic. It is a hot topic because it's related to China. As we all know, China has this amazing capability to turn many cold, dormant subjects to subject matters of great contention, fear, concern, and of course, it can also engender, even revive, great power competition. And China do not view this as a mere competition. It's a great struggle. This is what the Secretary General of the CCP, Xi Jinping, keeps talking about this. He just mentioned this great struggle, 伟大的斗争, just the other day. Now, this is the case because China is no longer a regional power. It is a great power, global power of global consequence. China view this great struggle not only from the perspective of traditional domains of economy, politics, and military, but also from a renewed focus on what they called Xinjiang, which is the new frontiers. China believes this control and dominance over those new frontiers will, to a greater extent, determine the final outcome of this great struggle. And those new frontiers, of course, include cyber, space, artificial intelligence, deep seas, electromagnetic platforms, and of course, polar regions. Polar regions are very important to China, and China view, in particular, the Arctic as the Suez Canal of the 21st century. So it has a great geostrategic importance as well as energy significance as well. So this is a very important topic, and today we're fortunate to have a great group of leaders, experts, and concerned citizens to gather here at the Hudson to discuss China's Arctic strategy, its implications to the region and far beyond. Before we start discussion, however, I'd like to express my special gratitude to my senior fellow, Arthur Herman, who is a truly Renaissance man here, and his interest and research has covered a large area. But his recent claim to fame is actually the Arctic, because he wrote a terrific book about the Vikings. I'm not talking about the surprisingly good football franchise in Minnesota. This is about those legendarily fierce marauders from the Arctic region in the past and its contemporary relevance. So thank you, Arthur. Arthur approached China Center some weeks ago for such a symposium, and we agree with alacrity. And we believe this is really a topic that's worth pursuing, along with great help from Rosalie Layton of the China Tech Threat, and we put together this conference. And thank you very much. I also like to pay special tribute to my able program manager, the very able and popular Shane Leary. I'm sure that his parents named him Shane for a particular purpose, because like Alan Ladd from the legendary Western movie Shane, and he's also very suave, capable, and very popular. So thank you, Shane, for coordinating all these major aspects of things required to take us where we are right now at this moment. So ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure and honor to now introduce our keynote speaker. He is Hudson Institute's own distinguished fellow, China Center's Advisory Board Chair, the 70th U.S. Secretary of State, America's fearless leader, and a great friend to the Chinese people. And last but not least is my former boss at the State Department, Mr. Mike Pompeo. Prior to his service at the State Department as America's top diplomat, Mr. Pompeo served as a director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Before this, he served 4 terms in Congress representing Kansas 4th District. Before he started his public service, Mr. Pompeo was a business leader in manufacturing, aviation, and service industries. He graduated first in his class at West Point in 1986 and served in the U.S. Army as a cavalry officer patrolling Iron Curtain before the fall of the Berlin Wall. After the Cold War was over, Mr. Pompeo graduated from Harvard Law School, where he was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. Mr. Pompeo worked as an attorney at Williams and Connolly immediately following Harvard. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Mr. Secretary Mike Pompeo.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you all here. It's great to be with so many remarkable, distinguished scholars to talk about an incredibly important subject. I have 2 also of my fantastic ambassadors who served alongside me in the Trump administration. When you were talking about surprisingly successful marauders, I think the entire Trump administration could be credited with that. It's great to be here this morning, too, to talk about a subject that I talked about when I was Secretary of State. Most famously when I was in Rovaniemi at the Arctic Council, where it was the last time I saw Foreign Minister Lavrov, actually, where he actually suggested that if we spent less time on the communique and more time drinking vodka, that the world would be more successful. I wish that they were spending more time drinking vodka and not causing so much havoc across the world today. You know, we spend an awful lot of time looking eastward to what's taking place in Europe and westward to what's taking place in the South Pacific and in the threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses in Asia proper. And we have tremendous domestic challenges here today, too. We have a campaign now just less than 4 weeks off. My team often reminded me, as did my ambassadors, that we needed to make sure that America looked north in ways that it hadn't done before. This matters to Americans. We don't think about ourselves as such often, those of us that live in places like Kansas, but we are indeed an Arctic nation. This began before 1867 when we purchased Alaska. The exploration in this place, intrepid souls who traveled there knew that this mattered. There was a brigadier general named Billy Mitchell who back as far as 1935 in testimony to Congress said that Alaska is the most strategic place on Earth. And it wasn't just its proximity to Russia or Asia that made it so. It was its prime location near the Arctic Circle that gave it such strategic significance. We all know, too, that the offshore resources in the Arctic Ocean have become the subject of renewed competition. Miles spoke to that. And it is now, given modern technology, even more strategically important to our country. I was mocked for the speech that I gave that day. I remember it well. I get over these things relatively easily. But I was mocked because I talked about the fact that whatever one thinks about climate change, you can see that this region is changing. Reductions in sea ice are opening new passageways, and with them incredible opportunities for trade. That was the word that actually caused everybody to have so much heartache and angst, saying that there were opportunities as a result of what was happening. People predict that the historic North Passageway could cut the time of shipment by weeks. The Russians certainly know that. The Chinese certainly know that as well. These are shipping lanes that will create seismic shifts on par with the Panama and Suez canals. You should know, too, that America's national security depends on this region. Every single Chinese land-based ICBM must fly through the Arctic region to hit its targets here in the United States and Canada. And our missile defense against such ICBMs, whether they come from Russia or China, are deployed in the Arctic area, primarily in Greenland and in Alaska. The work, the potential of this place can only be realized if every nation, including the non-Arctic nations, retain the right to engage peacefully there. Now, contrary to all the nonsense put out by the woke left, America is still a believer in free markets. There are some of us still. We need the rule of law and best practices in this region. And the competition there must be fair. That means parties in a fair, equal marketplace, reciprocal set of rules for all participants have to play by this identical, the very same set of rules. And those who violate the rules or disregard them for their own gain must forfeit their rights to participate in that very marketplace. Respect and transparency should be the price of admission in the Arctic. That lays out the challenge that the Chinese Communist Party presents. It is actively pursuing global dominance across multiple fields. Miles talked about this. Its overarching strategy is to pursue areas that the CCP has defined as res nullius, strategic places where there's no apparent sovereign entity, no governmental control. Miles talked about space, the moon. You can see it in cyber commons, the South China Sea. It has tried to include polar regions in this place as well. When I went to the Arctic Council, the Chinese wanted to participate as a so-called near-Arctic neighbor. Do the math, 900 miles, not so close to the Arctic. That'd be from here to my home state of Kansas. We don't think about that as a casual commute. There are 8, count them, 8 Arctic Council countries: Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and America, the United States. The Chinese Communist Party lacks any legitimate claim to sovereignty, even though it has made important to its own foreign policy this idea of it being that near-Arctic nation. Its economic ambitions in this region, in addition to its military ambitions, are very, very clear. We should take seriously their stated goal. I'll read it. They want to, quote, build a polar Silk Road, end of quote. The Russia-Yamal Peninsula was the first major part of this project. Chinese funding is the reason there is now a terminal on the peninsula supplying enormous amounts of energy, LNG, to China. Much of our attention was focused in the West, rightfully so, on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Europe, but more of our attention ought to be focused on the Yamal terminal. In August, 1 month alone, China imported 611,000 metric tons of liquefied natural gas from Russia. More than half of those shipments came from that terminal in the Arctic. The push to mine and obtain rare earth minerals drives China's Arctic ambitions as well, and this was its goal in trying to obtain a strategic foothold in Greenland. Sadly, it doesn't end with the economy and trade. The CCP have been trying to buy an old military base in Greenland. In 2016, it tried to move again, and it should be of deep concern to everyone in America today that earlier this year, Danish officials warned of heightened Chinese espionage there. Make no mistake about it, the CCP has deep strategic military intentions in the Arctic. So how to respond? What are the tools that America has, and what should our priorities be with respect to this? We started this right. We didn't complete it in the Trump administration. With respect to defense and national security, we hosted military exercises with our partners, strengthened our force presence. We built our Icebreaker fleet, expanded the Coast Guard funding, and created new senior military posts for Arctic affairs. These things increased American security and readiness in the Arctic. We need to continue and build on them, and I appreciate the fact that the Biden administration has begun to do so. But there was, when we left, and there remains today, a great deal more to be done. In this void, in this time of uncertainty, America needs to step up. Even as the Arctic Council is suspended, we need to work with our partners bilaterally to ensure a lack of cohesion does not allow other actors, namely the People's Republic of China, to move through the cracks. Practical steps. What can we do? What are the things that are before us? First, the CCP should never be permitted to be part of any organization, including the Arctic Council, that is trying to deliver outcomes for this special space. We kept it that way. I pray that the Biden administration will do so, and every administration after it. China is seeking to recast itself to create a new category of Arctic membership, and we should never permit it to do so. We should ensure that the Arctic Council adopts a set of new rules, regulations that prohibit state actors of non-Arctic nations from owning land, maritime assets, and extracting mineral resources in the region that have dual-use potential. And we should, of course, ban any military space presence in the Arctic region by any non-Arctic country. We know for sure that in a much larger sense, China's influence has proceeded elsewhere using multiple vectors, multiple tools. I talked about the terminal in Yamal. The CCP financed it. It used its economic power. And I've spoken here at this very podium before about the revisionist realignment which they attempt. This is a deep, grand conspiracy between Russia, China, and Iran, and other enemies of freedom coming together to use their shared resources in this very region. We can't permit that to happen. Allowing China to get the foothold it desires in the Arctic will empower it and Russia and bring Putin and Xi even more tightly together. This will threaten our capacity to protect the American people, and we must not let that happen. We can lead in the Arctic. We've done it before. I'm confident we will do it again. Our national security depends on it. And with it, I'm happy to have a good conversation with you all, and I know, Miles, you'll come up and help me get it started.
Okay, we can. I'm going to take this. Sure. All right, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for this wonderful remarks. And let me just ask the first question. So the U.S. obviously is one of the members of the Arctic Council. For many years, we actually enjoy the membership, but we have not taken a leadership role in any other particular Arctic participation, unlike Russia, Canada, and some other Arctic countries in Europe. How do you ensure that America would have much greater proactive participation in Arctic Council?
Two thoughts. First, it has to be focused leadership from the top, and that's hard, right? When you're the Secretary of State or you're the Secretary of Defense, there's lots of challenges in the world, and so to focus on this place, this problem set that seems distant and far, both geographically and in time, requires a team, a big team that's focused on it. So I would first of all say you have to apply the resources against the problem set by putting the right people in the right place and make sure they have access to senior leaders. Second, my experience with the Arctic Council was that it had become an environmental gab fest. They didn't want to talk about the security issues. They wanted to talk about climate change. So everyone would come together and we'd draft this beautiful communique, and we would talk about all things related to climate change. I'm happy to discuss all things relevant to keeping our clean air and our safe drinking water, but the national security implications that are happening there are something that you have to get the Arctic Council to actually focus on. And we made progress. We didn't get all the way. There is a natural reversion. This is a place that is hosted by largely European elites, and they like to have conversations in Brussels and Stockholm and drink tea and coffee. These are hard issues. These are real matters, and to not take the security implications of what's happening there seriously is the first mistake, and America can lead on that.
Yeah, okay, great. So for many of our European partners and allies, when they think about the security issue, their primary and preponderant concern is Russia. Russia obviously is much closer to Europe, understandably. Russia has this pretty dubious history in the past of aggression. So now the United States has shifted strategic focus away from Europe. We focus on the Indo-Pacific. We say China is the #1 national security agenda. How do we convince countries in Europe, particularly in Arctic Council membership, to sort of to go along with the American strategic shift? How do we convince those countries to say, hey, listen, China probably poses the equal, if not greater threat?
Facts and data. Look, with two of the Arctic Council members are now NATO members, right? Mm-hmm. We all know where the Russian Navy launches most of its submarine fleet, right? These are the very places in the Arctic. Make no mistake, the Chinese Communist Party is intent on this as well. I think we will, if you're asking how do we make this argument, I think the facts and what they can plainly see are real. They're confronting this challenge in Russia today. For the moment, quite rightly, that is their priority. But when you think about global energy shifts that will have resulted as a direct result of what Putin did, the challenge that the Chinese Communist Party presents, as most of that Russian gas will now go east, not west, I think you will see a heightened awareness of the challenge that the Chinese Communist Party presents to European countries as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and I'd also like to add that in terms of capabilities, I think that China is probably far more capable of exerting influence in any parts of the world, simply because the Chinese economy alone is more than 10 times bigger than Russia's. And think about that. China also spend a lot more money and energy on some of the new frontiers that we talk about that Russia is lagging behind. You know, cyberspace, deep sea, all those areas of new platforms of modern warfare. So yes, what about the issue of Arctic is different from Antarctica in the sense that you have many sovereign countries there. Within the Arctic country, they also have their dispute. And sometimes the dispute between Canada and Russia and among some other regional countries tend to obscure the larger strategic purpose. In other words, there's something much more to share in common by those countries. So this provide opportunity for countries like China to go in and to sort of try to divide and conquer. Is there any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's true. Although my sense was that as time went on, the commonality was beginning to exceed the differences amongst them. They can feel it. I talked about climate and military. In between that is trade. And that was a place they all had come to see, that the opportunity to move that product, frankly, move product from Europe to Asia through these passageways was something that they were very focused on. And it brought them all together to try and begin to think about what would that mean. I mentioned briefly the icebreaker fleet problem. The complexity around it was, it all sounds simple. Let's go build some icebreakers. Yeah. The complexity around it is staggering. We have processes, rules. We have an absence of an industrial base. It was something that we worked on diligently, and it was something that every one of those nations knew jointly we had to figure out together how to have a more robust, more capable, more reliable industrial base to build the capacity to move things commercial, and importantly, things strategic and military as well through the region. And that begins with being able to crack ice.
Okay, great. So I don't want to dominate this conversation, but if you have any, for the remaining few minutes, and if you have any questions from the audience, that'd be great. Arthur?
Thank you very much for your remarks and also your amazing piece in the Wall Street Journal today. Can you wait for the microphone? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, if you're going to talk about an article being amazing, you should wait for the mic.
Hi, Arthur, and thanks again for a marvelous talk, and thanks again for amazing Wall Street Journal piece with Vivek on Taiwan, the semiconductor industry, and the dangers that we face, all of us face, with China's ambitions there. And sometimes I think it's hard to get Americans to deal with the China issue simply because it's coming from so many different directions and in ways that are not just simply at a conventional military way in which we think about competition with during World War II or during the Cold War, but rather in very subtle ways, including in reshaping the dialogue and the narratives with which we deal with issues like climate change, for example, like dealing with what constitutes scientific research versus an extension of a strategic presence of a country, whether you're talking about in the Arctic or in the Antarctic in the case of China. And yet, at the same time, I think we're looking ahead now to an Arctic Council which is going to be dominated by members of NATO, with the addition of Finland and Sweden. And you're talking about trying to get the Arctic Council to pivot away from purely environmental issues towards more strategic and defense-related issues. Do you think that having a strong NATO engagement now with the Arctic Council can be a means by which to advance that kind of strategy?
I do think that increases the likelihood that that group, when brought together, will focus on geostrategic issues more broadly than it has for the last period of time. I think that does increase the chance of that because NATO has always been that security bulwark. And the fact that you now have a significantly higher percentage of the countries that are part of NATO, I think makes it more likely. And that's a good outcome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for an interesting speech. I have two quick questions for you.
Could you please identify yourself?
Yes, I'm Lisa Lotte Odgaard, Hudson Institute and Institute for Defense Studies in Norway. First, I want to ask you about China. Would you argue that they're planning to get a direct military presence in the Arctic, or do they rather work with Russia, for example, on sharing ISR, providing them with digital competences and giving them finance to build out their ports so that they have more of an indirect role in strengthening Russia's presence and creating strategic dilemmas for NATO through Russia? And second, do you think there is a need for a NATO strategy on the Arctic, or is NATO fine working in the Arctic without a strategy? Thanks.
Well, you should never work without a strategy. It's a bad idea. I've done that a few times. It ends poorly. So yes, NATO should think about it. NATO has thought about it. Great. Ambassador Hutchinson was. We were trying to convince NATO that it had an important role in confronting China in addition to its traditional role in Europe. China is in fact impacting NATO broadly everywhere. Think cyber. Think all kinds of different tools and ways. And to Secretary General Stoltenberg's credit, he had begun to advance that inside the NATO apparatus in very important ways, and so I applaud him for that. I'm sure where his focus is today, but I am confident he hasn't forgotten of that strategic challenge as well. The first question is sort of how will China and Russia approach this, and will China try to do this independently? I don't think there's any chance that China is going to do much independently. I think these two are now locked in. The visit between Xi Jinping and Putin, the first trip in 3 years of Xi Jinping out of China to go meet with Putin, I think is deeply telling. These two now will be locked in economically. They will be isolated in ways that I don't think they yet appreciate. So I think the Arctic will be just another place where we will find the two of them working together, whether that's using the existing Russian facilities in the Arctic to enhance Chinese training and capability, or they will go try and find other places, ways, means by which they can exert their security work together, their military work together. I think they'll do. I think it won't be a choices between the two. I think it will be all of the above. So I don't know that you'll find a Chinese military base there, but I am confident you will find Chinese military capable of extending its reach and power and projecting its power into that region, whether it's an asset that they own or one that they share with the Russians themselves.
Oh yeah, question over there.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Miles, for having us. My name is Phelim Kine. I work for Politico. Sir, we've watched with great interest your recent weeks, your big emphasis on China, your ongoing video series on YouTube, this focus on the Arctic. I just wondered, to a casual observer, this very much looks like the centerpiece for potential foreign policy plank of a future presidential run. I wonder whether you could speak to your ambitions in that regard. Please.
Did you have a second question?
I got a second one.
Because I'm likely to answer the first. So.
Okay, go.
Yeah.
That's the big one.
Yeah. This is something that matters to the United States of America, something I've been working on with many of the team members that are sitting in here today. I can't answer the question about what I'll be doing 2 months, 6 months, 8 months from now, other than to say that my effort to protect the United States from the Chinese Communist Party will be something I work on till the day that the good Lord takes me.
Thank you, sir. Quick follow-up. Xi Jinping is going to get a third term, start next week as General Secretary. What do you see as the outlook of U.S.-China relations with him solidifying power for maybe another decade or a lifetime? Thank you.
Xi Jinping's made very clear. That's a good question. He's made very clear that he wants to rule forever and that his rule should be over everything. And I think we should take that seriously. It's a nation with incredible wealth. As I've said in the video series, remarkable people. We should do everything we can to make sure that we demand that the Chinese Communist Party behave as a civil, decent actor. And I don't think Xi Jinping has any intention of doing that. So we can look for this confrontation to increase, not because America wants it to increase, not because we're asking any other nation to choose between China and Russia, but because freedom matters, and the rule of law matters, and the capacity to enforce contracts matters, and the ability to conduct payment in a system that is sufficiently transparent. These things matter to every family all across the United States of America, and so we have a responsibility to do our best to get that right. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, over there.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Pompeo. I'm Luke Coffey, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. With 7 out of 8 Arctic Council members now in NATO, and with this new geopolitical reality with Russia, which means that Arctic Council cooperation in any practical means has stopped and will not be operating in the foreseeable future, is it time that maybe we work with our like-minded allies in the Arctic and create a new structure? I don't like new flags and headquarters and secretariats, but maybe we need a new format for cooperation in the Arctic that can do the full range from security, oil spill cleanup, search and rescue, environmental concerns. What do you think about that idea? Thank you.
It's a really important question. Some of that happens today informally. So, you know, we build out these different organizations and we give them names, right? So we worked hard on the Quad. Maybe this one would be the Sept, right? I don't know. That's probably bad Latin. Someone will correct me. Or Greek or whatever the root of September is. But yeah, you have 7 nations, Arctic nations, who share a set of common values, and one outlier that sits in the Arctic Council that doesn't share our understanding of basic human dignity. I think there is a place for them to begin to work together. The level of formality is less important to me. To your point about secretariats and meetings and the like, that's less important to me than their capacity to understand their shared set of interests and their willingness then to apply resources against the problem set that is jointly identified. I think you're going to see the capacity of that to increase greatly. I think if there's one thing that I think that the Trump administration did really well with respect to the Chinese Communist Party is we unmasked 40 years of failed naivete. I'll be generous. That's as kind a way as I can describe what we did for 4 decades. We allowed the Chinese Communist Party to build their nation on the backs of the American people and the people of Europe. And I think the world can now see that, and we're all trying to figure out how to structure ourselves in a way to respond to that in a way that reflects our histories and our understandings of the world. I'm convinced that we're going to do it, and I think these nations working together, all NATO nations working together, you will see the security component of that continue to expand and increase in very important ways, in ways that redound to the benefit of those of us who enjoy sovereignty and basic decency with respect to our fellow man. So I appreciate that question. It's important. I hope I'm right about that optimism.
I said that was the last question that was designed strategically ambiguous so that I can ask the real final question. Yeah. The last question is, sir, when China started to act to march into area that of great concern, it's not just a concern of the Arctic countries, but also some of China's neighbors are also concerned about this. When China tried to get a stronger influence in Arctic countries like Japan and South Korea, they were also very eager to be part of the narrative. So how do we ensure that we can work with our friends and allies in Asia Pacific on the issue of Arctic and China's role in our region?
You know, I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. I do think it's important. They can all see it. I was in Japan a week ago, 10 days ago now, I guess. They can see it and feel it. I was with the Minister of Defense. We briefly spoke about this very issue, how it is you array forces that point in that direction as well. I don't know what the right forum is. I don't know what the right tools are, but we've all got to think about that.
Well, the issue is basically is related to the slots and the passage, and if China control that the international passage, and then Japan and South Korea also have a very strong demand for shipping, right, shorter routes, so they're worried about that too.
Yeah, no, they're deeply cognizant of both the security issues and the commercial implications of China controlling those lanes.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thanks,
and,
Miles. Thank you
very much.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you very much. So we're now going to move to the next phase, which is panel discussions, and so we're going to have a few moments, just a few seconds, to set up the panel, and then we'll continue. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.
Great. So you can make it this afternoon.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is a tough act to follow with the Secretary of State, but we are going to do our best. I think you'll agree we have an excellent panel. We're going to fill in the blanks from a lot of things that the Secretary discussed, help provide some additional perspectives. We're going to challenge your perception of the region and help you think bigger and deeper about the region. And we have our three panelists today. I'm going to introduce them to you, and we're going to proceed in the order of speakers, and followed with a session for Q&A. But first, let me introduce myself. I'm Rosalind Layton. I lead a project called China Tech Threat, where we study the technology run by the People's Republic of China and help educate the public and policymakers about how to protect their privacy, security, and prosperity. So today, I'm very pleased to have three excellent panelists. Lisa Lotta Altgall, she's a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute. She studies U.S., China, and European relations, including NATO-China relations. She's a professor at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies in Oslo, Norway. And she has her PhD in political science from Aarhus University in Denmark. She's published numerous books, articles, reports, op-eds, and on issues such as Chinese security and defense, the geopolitics of the Arctic, and NATO-China relations. Among her recent publications is an article in Survival, Global Politics and Strategy, which has just been published in August 2022 by Taylor and Francis online. It's called Russia's Arctic Designs in NATO. You can find it online. I highly recommend you read it. Lisa Lotta is going to refer to some points in her article and so forth. Great article to understand some of the background and politics, also the role of Russia. So we have Lisa Lotta. We have also Mark Latin, who's coming to us from Reykjavik in Iceland. And he is a professor of political science at the Arctic University in Norway, in Tromsø. He's the editor of Arctic News, the blog Over the Circle. His book, Chinese Foreign Policy, is now in its third edition. And he is now at a meeting of the, tell me again, the
Arctic Circle Assembly.
Arctic Circle Assembly, thank you. And he's going to talk about some points you can also read in his new article, The Rise and Fall, of the Polar Silk Road, just published in The Diplomat. And finally, it's a great honor to have with us Ambassador Kay Bailey Hutchinson. She was the 22nd U.S. permanent representative to NATO from 2017 to 2021. What an excellent tenure. Thank you for joining us. Ambassador Hutchinson was a senator from Texas from 1993 to 2013, quite a tenure as well. She also served in the state government, the great state of Texas, and now she's here to talk with us about her experience on the front line with NATO. So great to have you with us, so thank you. So let us begin with you, Lisa Lotta. I know you have a lot of things to help us put this discussion in perspective. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Rosalind, and thank you for inviting me to speak. It's always great to be back at Hudson. I'm going to address the issue of what role we can envisage for China in the Arctic in the coming decade or two. And the first question I want to address is the question if China is likely to become a military power in the Arctic. I've looked at that issue with two Americans in an article from 2019. And to us, it seems to be the wrong question to ask in a way, because the Arctic is very far down on the Chinese agenda at this time, when arenas for US-China competition, such as the Taiwan Strait, the Pacific Islands, the South China Sea, are hotspots in China's near abroad that repeatedly demand attention and resources. And Beijing seems to have little interest in establishing a military presence that would attract a lot of pushback from a region that is full of NATO allies and partners, as pointed out by Pompeo. So as a global great power, China has established a strategic presence in the Arctic, mainly through economic investments and through environmental and scientific engagements. But note that when it's challenged by countries denying, for example, denying China investments in strategic assets such as runway, airports, or mines, then China does not really make an issue out of it. They don't complain. They just quietly withdraw. And that's because China's assessment, we think, is that it's just not worth taking a major argument over or fight back or punish countries denying it access in the Arctic. Now, does that mean that China should not be watched and that we should not worry about China in the Arctic? No, certainly not. Because China has more subtle ways of establishing a presence that is at least as problematic as a sort of direct military presence. And I would argue that the concern or the challenge to do with China in the Arctic mainly comes from its cooperation with Russia, as pointed out also by Pompeo in his speech. Russia has plans to develop the Northern Sea Route, but it doesn't really have the money to do it properly on its own. It would also like to be able to create strategic dilemmas for NATO, and that's another issue that China can help Russia with, especially now that Russia is sort of really down and out economically and financially. It needs China more than ever, because for Russia, the Arctic is a top priority, and it will continue to be so, but it cannot maintain control of the Arctic Sea Route, and it cannot protect its strategic military assets around the Barents Sea region without getting help from China. And China will be more than happy, I would argue, to help Russia with these things. So the Northern Sea Route doesn't have that much container traffic, and it's not likely to get it for decades to come. There's still too much sea ice in the area, simply, to make it viable. However, the Northern Sea Route is already Russia's national Arctic waterway. And so that means that it does host domestic marine traffic and cargo such as mineral and energy resources. And of course, this is some of the really important export articles that are, transported along the Northern Sea Route. China is Russia's biggest export destination today, and China is more than happy to participate in developing the Northern Sea Route so it can secure access to sparse resources that Russia has and make itself less dependent on high security risk areas such as the Persian Gulf. And China has already begun to connect the Northern Sea Route to the Polar Silk Road that Pompeo talked about. And it does that by developing and linking port and rail hubs. And because Russia's economy has taken a downturn with its war in Ukraine, I would argue that now Moscow is more likely than before to approve Chinese projects that had been stalled because Russia was worried about too much Chinese influence. Now they cannot afford to say no. If Russia wants to maintain substantial strategic control, for example, by developing deep water ports in the north, they need help from China. They also need help from China to digitalize the Northern Sea Route, and that's necessary if Russia is to capitalize on the potential of this sea route. Last year, Russia already began laying its first undersea fiber optic cable on the seabed. In addition, I would argue that Russia and China are working on trying to insulate trade in, for example, energy and other commodities from punitive Western financial measures. And they do that by decoupling from the dollar. For for example, by increasingly using Chinese interbank payment systems and the digital yuan, which is already ready to be rolled out. So while a direct military role for China in the Arctic does not seem to be on the table, partly because China doesn't really want it, and partly because Russia doesn't like too much direct Chinese influence, and certainly not a China that operates independently along the Northern Sea route. Nevertheless, they can find ways of working together that will be profitable for them both. China, in a few years, is actually already capable of operating independently, including militarily, along the Northern Sea route, because they're developing nuclear-powered icebreakers and semi-submersible vessels used for salvage operations. So they really only need their own repair and replenishment facilities in Russian ports along the sea route to operate totally independently. But I don't think they're going to do that, because they understand to hold back and to not relinquish or to try to take too much control out of Russia's hand. They have already proven that in their cooperation with Russia in Central Asia, and I think they will do the same in the Arctic. So a more limited supporting role for China, particularly focusing on sharing intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, I think is more likely. That would allow Russia to increase militarization of the Northern Sea route, to maintain control as sea traffic increases, and to tighten control of the entry and exit points to the Barents Sea, where all its strategic defense assets, such as the strategic submarines, are located. If they cooperate on intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, that will help allow Russia to perform submarines attacks against NATO assets, should they want to do that, in the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, the so-called Geo gap. And it will also help Russia being able to perform a missile attack against the US mainland. That will most likely happen through Greenland airspace, because it's so badly surveyed. Chinese investments in infrastructure, energy, and mining across the Arctic provide Beijing with lots of dual-use ISR capabilities, and data gleaned and shared by China would enhance Moscow's and Beijing's ability to threaten NATO supply lines in the North Atlantic. It would also help them to coordinate challenges to NATO along China's coastline and Russia's border with NATO, so that NATO is suddenly very busy along a huge geographical area. There is also talk of integrating Russian and Chinese satellite navigation systems, and I believe they've already taken the first steps to do so. If they go ahead with this, it could further strengthen strategic collaboration by helping them to complicate NATO power projection through coordinated GPS disruption operations. So the GPS, satellite navigation systems coordination and collaboration is another area to watch. Joint reconnaissance capabilities would also refine Moscow's ability to use precision-guided missiles against NATO's defense infrastructure in the Arctic. The big question is there the degree of trust between China and Russia to have such kind of integration, as I just mentioned? Because it requires considerable trust, and the partnership may not be strong enough and durable enough to generate it. So I think that's a key question that's hard to answer, and we'll have to pay attention to it in the decades to come. So the main point here that I'm making is that China doesn't plan to establish a direct military presence for the foreseeable future, but they do plan to help Russia maintain control along the Arctic Northern Sea Route, and to be able to keep on threatening NATO, for example, by being able to send its submarines out in the Atlantic without being stopped by us. The U.S. recently published its U.S. Arctic strategy, and that promises to strengthen military presence and cooperate with allies and partners. However, I believe it remains to be seen if NATO countries are willing to invest in the assets that are necessary to counter the scenarios I just talked about, and which will take decades to prepare. We need Arctic frigates, we need submarines, we need air and missile defense. Are we going to have that so that we can protect ourselves against the threats that are likely to come and are already there in some cases? I think that's a key question as well that the NATO countries need to consider, and I believe some of the coming panelists will speak to that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, you have such excellent remarks. You include your questions, so I appreciate that. Well, let's move to our next panelist, Mark Lantin. Mark, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me today. It's been interesting following the dialogue about China's Arctic interests. And so what I'd like to do with my time is to bring up a few talking points, some of which have already been brought up by previous speakers. But I want to start out with the idea that China is a newcomer in the Arctic. It is still very much trying to play catch up in many areas of Arctic affairs. And I'm not just talking about government-to-government issues and matters of security and diplomacy, but also understanding the Arctic as a region which is undergoing some very profound change. Because China is still learning about the situation in the Arctic here, it is still very dependent on the support of Arctic governments, and that includes Russia, for a lot of its policies. Now, there was a lot of discussion about some of the remarks that were made by Xi Jinping a few years ago about his interest in China becoming a polar great power, 集的强国. And that was interpreted in several different ways, some of which would suggest that China was seeking a much stronger strategic role in the Arctic. But it is important to look at the idea of polar great power in a variety of different ways. Certainly, it does reflect China's strategic aims. But it also reflects the fact that Beijing still has a lot of inexperience in the Arctic and is still learning quite a bit about what is happening here. So the idea of great power not only suggests might, but also knowledge. So I think that needs to be taken into account right from the beginning. Another point which I'd like to make right at the beginning is that China is not acting as a revisionist state in the Arctic at present. If you look at a lot of China's diplomacy up here, Beijing has really tried to be a joiner of Arctic regimes. It became an observer in the Arctic Council in 2013. It has been very active in initiatives since then. That would include the Polar Code, the recent fishing ban in the Central Arctic Ocean. And Beijing has really tried to put forward the idea that we want to be a positive participant in Arctic regime building. Now, international observers have been quick to point out that in some cases, China has also been supportive of international law. It has not challenged UNCLOS, for example, in the Arctic. And there's also been quite a bit of discussion about how China has responded to some US policy in the region, including what happened in 2019, the discussion about the United States seeking to purchase Greenland, despite the fact that one could argue that it was in at least partial contravention of a 2009 Self-Government Act between Copenhagen and Nuuk. So any kind of negotiations should have been undertaken not with Copenhagen, but with Nuuk. And this kind of situation is something that China has made note of. So the concern is that, okay, well, what is the United States really seeking from its Arctic strategies? Now, the third point is that China is very much placing an emphasis on developing scientific knowledge in the Arctic, which has been the basis of the concept of Jinbeji Guojia, near Arctic state. And this, again, has been a term which has been subject to wide interpretation over the past few years. It is important to note that this term did not come directly from the Chinese government. It was actually an academic term that was bandied about quite a bit, at least as far back as 2010. There was an interesting book by Liu Junyan, Geopolitics in the Arctic and China's Response, which was written in 2010. And this was a time where China was still trying to understand the changes that were taking place in the Arctic. This was before it became an observer in the Arctic Council. There was a lot of academic literature in China which was suggesting that some sort of Monroe Doctrine was beginning to appear in the region. And there was discussions about the so-called melon scenario. So the Arctic is cut up into 8 pieces like a melon, and if you're not an Arctic state, you get nothing. And this was certainly a concern that China had at the time. So when talking about near Arctic state, again, there are many different facets here that need to be understood. It is not necessarily geography, although that is definitely a part of it. But it also reflects the fact that what is happening in the Arctic is affecting China like it has many other parts of the world. A lot of reports in Chinese academia about changed weather patterns in China, which can be directly traced to climate change in the Arctic. Everything from snowfall to pollution patterns have been a subject of study. So it goes back to the point I made, is that China is seeking a lot of information about the region. And because China is a very large player in the international system, it wishes to develop a presence in the Arctic. Now, China's Arctic White Paper, which was published in 2018, did stress the idea that non-Arctic states do not have the right to claim sovereignty in the far north, but they do have the right to engage in economic and scientific activity in accordance with international law. And this led to a great deal of discussion about the overall role of non-Arctic states in the Arctic. Now, China absolutely is seeking greater participation in Arctic governance. Any new areas of cooperation, China very much wants a seat at that table. This is in keeping with the larger trend, in my view, of the internationalization of the Arctic. The fact that many non-Arctic states have stepped forward to say, okay, we don't have Arctic geography, but we have a lot of interest and we should have a voice in what is happening in this part of the world. And several other countries, I could point to Britain, France, Germany, Japan, even Singapore, which is not exactly known as a polar state, have stepped forward and said, yes, we do have very considerable Arctic concerns. So to say that the whole idea of internationalization of the Arctic is simply a China issue doesn't really fit the reality. Now, why have we seen discussion about the internationalization of the Arctic? Well, a lot of it has to do with climate change concerns and the economic opening of the region. And I would argue that there really needs to be a much wider discussion about better balancing the concerns of Arctic versus non-Arctic states. Now, this could take place in many different ways. Like one very complicated topic, which usually gets me into trouble, is when I mention the idea of an Arctic treaty. Certainly not saying that that would be the perfect solution, nor am I saying that that particular idea would be easy. But I think the time has come to really discuss how much the Arctic has become an international concern. Now, there was discussion about the Polar Silk Road, and in the piece that I wrote recently, I was exercising a bit of caution, stressing a bit of caution about the overall impact of the PSR in the Arctic. Simply put, the Polar Silk Road is really experiencing quite a few headwinds right now, caused by a variety of factors, some of which have been out of Beijing's control, such as the pandemic and the current state of the global economy. But you could also argue that some Chinese policies have created a bit of a backlash in the region, including the deterioration of bilateral relations that China has with Canada and with Sweden, as well as pushback from other Arctic governments such as the United States and Denmark. If you look at the current state of the Polar Silk Road right now, once you take Russia out of the equation, there is simply not much there. There is simply not much in the way of specific projects that are currently active in the Arctic related to the Polar Silk Road. I can give one example here. There's a bridge not too far away from here in Harstad, which was financially supported by China, and that's been pretty much China's contribution to the Polar Silk Road in Norway. Even when you look at Russia, there are quite a few projects, the Baikonur Railway, for example, that have been on the books now for quite some time, but still have no particular timetable. And we've also started to see signs since March that some Chinese firms have started to push back, or pull back, I should say, slightly, from direct economic cooperation with Russian interests in Siberia and the Russian Far East. And it was also recently announced that there were no plans for Chinese cargo vessels to make use of the Northern Sea Route this year. As was noted, this is definitely because China is very worried about sanctions, worried about getting hit with the same types of sanctions that have been affecting Russia since its invasion of Ukraine. Now, my concern here is that there's still the tendency to view the Polar Silk Road as advancing very rapidly and representing a great deal of actual investment, Chinese investment in the region. In August of this year, when NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was visiting Canada, during a press conference, he referred to Beijing as, I'm quoting here, investing tens of billions of dollars in energy, infrastructure, and research projects in the High North. The situation right now is that, yes, China did have a lot of very ambitious plans in regards to ports, railways, various transit hubs, mines in Greenland, but very few of these have actually come to fruition. The most recent US Arctic strategy paper, which just got published, made a similar assertion, quoting here, over the past decade, the PRC has doubled its investments with a focus on critical mineral extraction. Well, doubled its investments, bearing in mind that China was working off a very low platform to begin with. And critical mineral extraction, yes, China did have very ambitious investment plans in Greenland. With one exception, I believe that would be Citronen Fjord up in northern Greenland. Many of these projects are now on hold. So looking at Greenland, for example, a lot of what China was seeking to do there has not come to pass. Some of which due to intervention from the US, Denmark, as well as shifting political winds in Greenland itself. Right now, China's investment in Greenland is a very tiny fraction of Danish investment, just to give an example. Now, going to the core issue, China's military interests in the Arctic, I completely agree that right now they are muted. Right now, China is very much deferring to Russia when it comes to this area of cooperation. And the fact is, from a cost-benefit analysis, what China very much wants is an open Arctic, one where economic cooperation can flourish. Militarization of the Arctic is not in Chinese interest. It cannot afford, especially now, China cannot afford to be seen as an Arctic gatecrasher. So discussion about, for example, the PLA deploying submarines to the Arctic, that really makes a very arguable assertion that Russia would be in a position to acquiesce to that, especially considering there have been so many policy papers and so many speeches by the Putin regime that have placed the Russian Arctic as central to the Russian economy and to Russia's strategic interests. So the idea that Russia will simply stand back and allow China to deploy submarines and deploy a unilateral military strategy in the Russian Arctic, it can be debated. Now, Beijing has certainly identified the polar regions as a new strategic frontier, and it's very likely that the polar regions will be more closely incorporated into Chinese security interests. But the questions now are how and what obstacles to be overcome. I completely agree that the issue of dual-use information gathering in the Arctic is a very serious one, given the structure of China's government, the fact that China has a lot of interest in playing catch-up regarding data in the polar regions. This has been definitely a concern in Antarctica. I've had the chance to look into that as well. And this does factor into questions regarding deeper scientific cooperation with Beijing. On the other hand, though, it can't be ignored that there are other security issues in the Arctic which require, to be blunt, all hands on deck. The climate change emergency here in the Arctic is becoming more and more visible every year, and international responses will be required, Arctic states and non-Arctic states. One final point I want to make before getting to just some ideas about recommendations is that the Arctic is not the South China Sea. I wrote a piece on that a short time ago as well. Beijing's claims to the latter are based on two issues which are simply not present in the Arctic in regards to China's interests. One is sovereignty, which is not something China can claim in the Arctic. And the other is the very nebulous concept of historic waters. And again, China simply cannot make a claim there. So it is very likely that the Central Arctic may evolve into an international legal headache. There's already been some issues about continental shelves and so forth. But China has very little role to play there. So assuming China's behavior in the South China Sea will simply be picked up and transplanted wholesale to the Arctic, really assumes that China has a very monolithic foreign policy and security policy, and there's very little sign of that right now. So to conclude, I just have a few recommendations to discuss. First of all, China is and will continue to be an Arctic stakeholder. It simply is not going to be pushed out of the region. So the question, therefore, is how the United States and other Arctic countries can best address this. The second point is that it is really crucial for the Arctic governments to make a very clear distinction between China's preferences in the Arctic and its capabilities. The two are not the same. And if anything, the space between the two is now widening. As one of my colleagues in London, you said it really well. If you constantly concentrate on what isn't there, you lose sight of what is there. And I think that's very important when looking at China's Arctic strategies. Third point, there was an interesting piece in the Financial Times by Catherine Hill a short time ago, noting that one of the symptoms of the growing communication gaps that have appeared between China and the United States is the risk of so-called confirmation bias, the seeking out of only that information which fits a specific narrative. And I really think that needs to be kept in mind when considering China's developing Arctic interests. There was also a very good piece in Foreign Affairs by Jessica Chen Weiss, which made similar warnings about the United States adapting too strong a zero-sum approach towards China, focusing too much on the competition and less on providing attractive alternatives, I should say. I stress again, there are many other security emergencies in the Arctic, not only climate change, but human security, health, development, education, which the United States and other Arctic states really need to step up and address more directly. The recent US Arctic policy paper, it is a very promising first step, but what needs to follow are solid actions, as well as some confirmation that the United States is going to be in the region for the long term, is really going to play a solid role in helping to deal with the Arctic's various security issues in the longer term. And finally, last point, we're going to be heading into a very interesting time in Chinese politics in the next few days. The Party Congress is going to be very key. And I would argue that there will need to be a recalibration of examinations into China's Arctic policy, as well as its international relations as a whole. As I can imagine that what comes out of this Party Congress is that there's going to be some very significant course changes in a lot of China's international relations. So that's going to be very interesting to see. And I guess I'll finish by saying watch this space. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mark. So many interesting points here. So now we're going to go to you, Ambassador Hutchinson. And I'm sure that these comments bring up so much for you. And I hope that you'll share your impressions. And, you know, we certainly have a lot of questions and what you would advise now for the people having your role.
Yes, thank you so much. It is such a relevant topic, and I'm really glad Hudson is doing this and with Secretary Pompeo. And I want to just take a step back in the overall issue and the relationship with NATO and say that the whole geopolitical strategy in the world, but particularly as it relates to Europe, changed in February of this year. And it affects every part of our geopolitical security strategy. And of course, it affects Russia. That's our current, but it also affects our vision of the relationship with China. And this has affected NATO as well. You know, Putin expected to be able to roll into Ukraine as he has into Georgia, as he has into Crimea, Ukraine, and take it quick and declare that the mother Russia is now convening since the loss of the Soviet Union. Well, what Putin has gotten is the opposite. It is the strengthening of Ukraine as a sovereign nation, the recognition of Zelensky's incredible leadership and the spirit of the Ukrainian people. But also the side effect that Putin wanted was to divide NATO more, because they've been doing hybrid and cyber attacks for years, trying to divide nations of NATO. And they have not only solidified NATO, they've also increased the range by adding two of the most capable allies that will happen very quickly by NATO standards, Finland and Sweden. So that then also comes into the whole strategy, and that is when Mike Pompeo was the Secretary of State, I was at NATO, Carlos Sands was in Denmark. That was when we started saying China is a potential competitor, a potential adversary, and there is now a great power competition. Our European allies resisted that in the beginning. They wanted to keep the relations because of the trade relations with China, and until February of this year, really didn't sign on to our whole strategy, though we were pressing it for the last 3 years, watching and looking at what China did began to solidify NATO, not only against Russian aggression, but also now looking at China. And I will just take a step back and say that China also, with their own actions, solidified this by their Belt and Road Initiative in Europe, where they were very heavy-handed in their effort to take over more and more port infrastructure, the predatory lending that they were doing, the whole Huawei effort to infiltrate all of the communication systems, which was resisted by America, but not so much Europe until they started seeing these other activities. And then there was COVID on top of that, and China not preparing the world for what COVID could do. And China, with its own actions, then started solidifying this U.S.-led effort that we've got to be much more serious about China. And we saw in the strategic concept of the Heads of State Summit in June, where for the first time, NATO invited 4 heads of state from Asia, and they came, and it became a much more global effort, reaching out to partners then to say, we have one way to deal with China, and that is unity of the most important economies of the world. Because if you look at the way we deal with Russia, yes, oil is a factor in the relations that have kept Russia afloat, frankly, for years, even when they have been menacing to Europe. But China relies on trade with the great economies. So they're not going to take the same positions as Russia. And we have a leverage that we don't have with Russia. And that is, if we are unified, that we can have an impact on then what China is able to do. So now fast forward to the Arctic. This has also played out in the Arctic, and I think the Arctic area, the high north we call it, is now very much a priority. It's a priority for our NATO countries. Now we're going to have 2 new Arctic based countries in the high north. And whereas I will say the Arctic Council had not really wanted NATO involved because they didn't see the security until February of this year needs. Now the new geostrategic security issues are affecting the Arctic and including NATO. And already NATO has extended its AOR, which is its area of engagement, to include the Arctic, where it does affect the NATO allies. So that is now a NATO AOR, and it is going to increase the NATO efforts for sure in the Arctic. Now, we have seen submarines coming into the Arctic, even going into the Atlantic from the Arctic. So we know that the climate change that is allowing the ice to start melting is affecting that whole security outline. Now, let's look at the way China has built methodically and strategically their economy. Secretary Pompeo mentioned 40 years. We were ones that wanted to get China into the WTO and allowed them to get in early, because we thought if we bring them into the tent, then they will begin to operate in the rules-based order. So we, as Secretary Pompeo said, we have helped them build their economy. And now they have this economy, but they've done that by quietly moving forward, not raising it as a big flag. And so I hear what we're hearing here with our panelists and others out there that aren't really sort of thinking, well, China's just playing it safe, they're not going to make waves. But here's where this Russia-China commitment to each other for life agreement comes into play, because they do want to be in the Arctic, and they are trying to get infrastructure in the Arctic. And the Danes stepped up very quickly, recognizing what they were trying to do, trying to get infrastructure, trying to do the Polar Belt Road. And I think that they have done this in the ways that have tried not to draw attention. But look at the way they have built up their militaristic efforts in the South China Sea, on the coast of Japan. And they've done it in a way that wouldn't attract attention in the beginning. So the fishing boats and the commercial boats that are patrolling the waters outside of Japan, funny, they're wearing military uniforms. Funny, they have arms on board these commercial ships. So now, fast forward again to the Arctic. They're trying to get places where they can do research. They're trying to get places where they are trying to get runways, as you mentioned. They're trying to get ports. They're trying to get facilities. That they want property to be able to put air facilities, all the things that you have pointed out. But doing it quietly when they're rejected or they don't push back openly. But this is part of a strategy, and it's part of their game plan. It's a part of their rule books of how they operate. And I think that we are recognizing it. I think that NATO is recognizing it. I think the Arctic Council, that has been resistant to security until now know they need the heft of NATO. NATO is increasing. They're increasing their troop strength with NATO forces from 50,000 in Europe to 300,000. That was the commitment they made at the strategic concept. So that means more troops, more assets. It's going to mean more spending, but I think Europe is now willing to do it. And I think it is going to open a whole area for the Arctic to have much more heft. In the U.S. military budget this year, you could correct me on the numbers, but I'm right on the issue. They have authorized now, and they're funding at least 8 icebreakers. Now, someone might pipe up and say, no, it's really 11. It may be 11, but it is a significant change. And that is all Arctic related. So I think now that I would say this is becoming a priority. If we look at the change in the geopolitical security, and then we look at the change in, and we look at the Chinese way of operating, we've got to take this very seriously. We've got to make it a priority. And we've got to back that up, which America's doing, and I think our allies are also now doing. But this Russia-Chinese partnership is the only way that China gets in a significant way. And so they are staying hitched with Russia. Probably it's part of the reason that they're being so neutral in this dreadful invasion of Ukraine. But China they are wedded to Russia if they want that Arctic, but other reasons as well. They're buying oil from Russia, but if China got assets into the Arctic, they would start having their own capabilities to use some of the vast resources that are estimated, and you mentioned, and some of the articles have mentioned that the resources that they think that is natural gas and oil under the Arctic, when you can finally get to it, is probably just something that China is looking at as something that would make them more independent of Russia or the Middle East or America in that particular area. So I think that it's very serious. I think we are taking it seriously. I think that probably in the public domain, it's not where it needs to be, but I think all of the writings and the high north, especially focus on this, that is now also being recognized in NATO and accepted by the high north as NATO being a major help and advocate in this area. But everything changed in February, and that, I think, has created this unity, and I think what will follow is the unity in the Arctic.
Excellent. Well, thank you. So, well, let's go to our Q&A session. Can we, Mark, would you join us again via video? Okay, well, thank you. Ambassador Hutchinson, let's start with you. It's a question I'm going to pose to you, and the other panelists can also comment. Last Friday, the White House released the Arctic Strategy, and it is based on 4 pillars: security, climate, development, and cooperation. And climate and development are specifically focused on the people of Alaska, sustainable development, and also addressing climate change issues for Alaskans, Native peoples, and so forth. Now, it seemed to be well received, and I would like to mention, for example, Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska, who said this is fine, but the strategy does not mention responsible resource and energy development in the region. So what I would like to suggest to you, or ask you, given what you've shared, what kind of a green world is it if Russia can go, Russia and China can get the liquid natural gas of the Arctic region, because Russia has sovereignty, they can use their ships to go back and forth and enjoy liquid natural gas, but everyone else cannot because they have a green agenda which doesn't allow them to do it. I'm going to play devil's advocate here. What kind of a green strategy is that? And what, if we have a sense that there's supposed to be some deterrence, does that not get deterred because it's Russia's sovereignty to do it? I'm curious, how do you see that, and any thoughts you have on the White House strategy?
Well, I think that certainly the White House strategy is a good step in the right direction, and focusing on the Arctic shows again that it is a priority for America. But your point is excellent, and that is that we have been hamstringing Alaska, as well as our ability in the Gulf of Mexico, which I know well, through regulatory bringing down the capability. I'm trying to think of the right way to describe this, because we have the reserves. And what is happening is the regulatory environment is not encouraging companies to actually do the drilling that would make us energy independent again, because the damper that they're putting on pipelines and refineries is keeping the companies from seeing that they could get their investment back if they did go into the leases that they already have, or look for new leases in the Gulf and in Alaska. And what I think is missing here is the importance of our own independence, but also the importance of the ability that we have, if we would unleash our resources, to help our allies that are not going to be able to get their heating from natural gas from Russia this winter. And we would be able to be exporting LNG right now if we had the energy policy that would produce. Now, let me just say one more thing. One thing that I think the environmentalists who want to tamp down the production of oil and natural gas are not taking into account that America has the regulations that require clean production, the cleanest in the world, much cleaner than China and Russia. And when you look at what's happening, where coal is being substituted in many places in Europe under desperation because they are losing the natural gas, we could be providing clean natural gas and clean oil production in Alaska, rather than going to countries that are going to not do it as clean as we are. And if they're going to come across the Arctic and down into Alaska, then Americans are going to be breathing the foul air that they're not producing, but is being produced right across the strait. So I would hope that the environmentalists would start seeing the value of our own capabilities and doing it in the right way, and open the spigots so that we could become energy independent, which protects our economy, makes us self-sufficient, and gives us the ability to export to our allies that will be suffering from what they're not going to be able to get from Russia. It just makes so much sense. And to know that we will do it environmentally in a friendly way. And when we go out and ask others, foreign countries that we know produce not as clean as we do, to produce more, I think we should say to all who will listen, we can do this. The way to keep other countries from affecting our gasoline prices is for us to be in control. And we will do it environmentally safely.
So Mark, I want to turn to you, and let me just recognize I share some kinship with you. I'm an American, but I'm also a Danish citizen, an academic. You're a Canadian in Norway, so you also bring two perspectives and multiple perspectives. And let's say Denmark and Norway are countries that are energy independent and actually have multiple sources of energy. Denmark exports renewable energy. It also has oil. Norway has a lot of oil. It's done tremendous research in the Arctic region. Now, if you go to the rest of Europe, there's a very different sense because they're actually quite dependent on Russian gas. So how do you see this this question? Is there a revision of environmental policy? Is there a balance? How does this play into security as you see it?
Thank you. No, I'm very pleased that the issue of energy security is being brought up because in addition to Alaska, this is also a very strong political debate in Norway. To paraphrase St. Augustine, it's a question of, okay, give us environmental policy, but not yet. because when oil prices began to fall during the pandemic especially, there was a lot of discussion in Norway about, okay, should we make the move away from oil towards more alternative energy sources? A lot of that has begun to dissipate, both because of the fact that oil prices are back up again, but more to the point, as you correctly note, many other parts of Europe are looking to Norway as well as other oil-producing countries to help offset oil that is not being brought in, oil and gas that is not being brought in from Russia. So how to basically reconcile that is going to be very key. And I agree that there is going to need to be a balance between short-term need for fossil fuels and longer-term environmental concerns. But at the same time, though, look at what has happened over the past few summers. And I say from experience up here in northern Norway that we have seen incidents of forest fires. We have seen record temperatures. And in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere over the past few months, we saw a lot of records being broken. And this is not something that is restricted to either Europe or North America or even to Asia. This is being seen everywhere. So the concern is that if there is going to be a move more towards short-term oil and gas development, what will be sacrificed in terms of the global campaign against climate change towards more environmental responsibility? Because as the Norwegian Foreign Minister noted very recently, the Arctic doesn't have a pause button. This is not something that can simply be put on hold because of economic concerns. The climate change emergency is real and it is growing.
So, Lisa Lotta, you've teed up so many great questions in your remarks. Let me bring you back to some of those. And also, you had also asked a question of Secretary Pompeo, which I think was excellent. So today, in these discussions, we've heard about China is a clear and present danger. We have heard about, it's really a stealth threat. It's going into Russia, that's really what we have to worry about. But also, I think, as you so well point out in your article, that this relationship is very tenuous. It is not one based on trust. And I think that it's important to underscore that, given for, let's say, typical American audience, sometimes assumes that because Russia and China both have a history of communism or authoritarianism, that they're natural allies, when actually they were great competitors. And that doesn't mean they're going to work so well. But it also seems, given Ukraine and the rest of the world, that we may be pushing these two bedfellows together where they wouldn't have been cooperating. Maybe would you give us your view that there's different ways we might prioritize the Arctic as foreign policy people, between, let's say, what defense experts would say, must act today, very dangerous, versus others, be careful, don't miscalculate, versus another element altogether, we don't even know, which I think you point out so well.
Thank you for that great question. I think in the short term, we have managed to pull China and Russia somewhat apart because China doesn't want to be seen to breach the sanctions. They are still hoping that they can have a special relationship with Europe, even if it's not going that well. So I think China at the moment is lying low, actually, with its cooperation with Russia. But I don't think we should be fooled by that, because in the Arctic specifically, I think they have long-lasting interests, as I described, in working with Russia, because as Mark also provided us a lot of detail on, China doesn't really have the option of being a major power in the Arctic. They're a newcomer. They don't want to be having a lot of pushbacks and battles in a region that's not at the top of their priorities, because that's their near abroad. But at the same time, they have a really hard time managing the US pushback together with Japan and its allies in Asia. So if it can keep Russia as a military power that can bother NATO countries in the Arctic, that would be a significant China interest. And they have the sort of possibility to share intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So space, cyber cooperation, I think, is very important for these two powers in the Arctic. And it can really bump up Russia's ability to bother NATO. This is not going to happen in a year or two. It's going to happen over some decades, but we also need some decades to build up our capabilities to prepare for this. China is looking to the global south as well. So it has published strategies lately that indicates that it will increasingly turn to the global south because China doesn't want to be caught out by sanctions and by this scenario it faces now one more time. And that means decoupling from Western financial systems will slowly pick up speed. Trade not in dollars, but in yuan, rubles, rupees is taking off. That's bad, bad for us, but that's happening, and it has a stronghold. China has a very significant economic stronghold in Asia because it has delivered the money for the infrastructure they want. Sometimes they're then indebted to China, but it doesn't change the fact that China historically for the past decades have been good at delivering on these things. And so I don't think we have much of an option to draw China towards us, to be honest. I do think we need to prepare for a competitive overall relationship for decades to come. I think the current sort of lying low on China's part is because it's been caught out in how bad Russia did in the Ukraine war. It doesn't yet have the financial and other systems in place to just provide an alternative. But it will work on making itself less dependent on us. And that doesn't necessarily speak to our interests. Thank you.
So I think the point is well taken. It's never a great time. It seems like that we're behind. We have to make investments. I at least seem grateful that the work of the State Department, we have a NATO ambassador here, we have also a ambassador U.S. to Denmark, succeeded to tell a lot of European governments they have to increase their spend in NATO. And that was a difficult message, but it came through. And if they go from 50,000 to 300,000 troops, maybe that was a good outcome. We have as our keynote today Assistant Secretary General Angus Lapsley, who will be addressing our group. And so it will certainly be interesting to hear his comments. At this point, I'd like to go to some audience questions. We have just 7 minutes, but we can take a question or two if people have them. Okay, all right. Well, we have, great, we have a little extra time. Great. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Just gonna get you want water.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for a very fascinating and informative discussion, all of you. And what's interesting about this is, although one senses a certain amount of tension between the different presentations, which I think is really good, actually, I think at the same time, what I came out of all this is some really hopeful indications of where this kind of discussion can go. And since I'll be moderating the next panel, it's one of the things that I want to follow through on. Because we have, on the one hand, we have Mark's presentation with a relatively benign view about what China's ambitions and involvement in activities in the Arctic have been. We've had Lisa Lutte's presentation, which says, when you're keeping track of what's happening with China, you should better also keep your eye on what's happening with Russia, because the two of those have now worked out a condominium of interests in the Arctic, which means that you have to be aware of where China is going, using Russia as their stalking horse in terms of their strategic posture. And then we also have the ambassador's point of view, which is that maybe when we think about what China's overall strategy and agenda looks like, that we need to think about it perhaps less in terms of a South China Sea model, but maybe more about the role that they've played in trying to extend their influence and shape the political landscape in Europe, the role that they've played in the Indian Ocean, and so on, to really understand how Chinese ambitions evolve over time. based on how they establish themselves with a foothold in an area or on an issue and in shaping the discussion. And yet at the same time, I think what comes out of this, and Mark's data points I think are extremely helpful with this, and that is China is still trying to play catch up in the Arctic. That this is one of those occasions in which, in dealing with China, we're not chasing after the train that's left the station, but that we can actually get on and help to guide where that is. And what strikes me that comes out of all of this discussion and all three of your presentations is, number one, the need for a real clarity of vision in terms of where we are with the strategy in how to deal with China in the Arctic. Clarity which, frankly, I don't really get from the current White House document, but which needs to be fleshed out. When I think about strategy, I think about how you bring ends and means together, and I didn't really get much of that from that particular document. But that we also have time, that there is time to arrive at a clarity of vision, number one, and to take steps that we make sure that as China does inevitably become a player in the Arctic region as a near Arctic power, that it's one that will be constructive, that will be helpful towards the stability in that region, and that it is one that doesn't come with nasty surprises coming on because we haven't thought about what we need to do and haven't already taken steps in that direction. That's a comment, it's not a question, but I throw it back to the
Sure.
panel.
Well, do you have I'll make it a question, or do you have a response?
I have a comment.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I think, in a way, in another report that I did for Hudson, I would describe China's approach in general to the West as a Janus-faced approach, because, and the Arctic is a good example, I think, because it's totally correct that China is a latecomer, and it hasn't had as much success as expected in investing in strategic infrastructure, as I mentioned early in my speech. So it has been denied buying runways, mines, old naval bases across the NATO countries. And it hasn't complained too much about it because it doesn't want to appear to be a bad guy. It has worked very, hard in the scientific and environmental various forum, and there's a lot of them in the Arctic. It has obtained leadership positions in these, and it does have legitimate interests, as do many other countries, in the environmental and scientific issues of the Arctic, because China's climate is very affected by this. But in doing this, it has also, as you pointed out, established a strategic foothold in many places. And sometimes, for example, with space capabilities to create up and down links, you just need a building. You don't need huge investments. So, I mean, it's not necessarily much they need to be able to create some capabilities and have some resources that are dual use and that can also be used against the West. And I think in the Arctic, while China is still keeping its options open, there is, to my mind, also no doubt that because they want to have a strategic foothold, they want to make sure that Russia remains a significant power that can balance the West as they see it, in my view. They do have an interest in sort of cooperating with Russia, and I don't think that will go away. So in that sense, you could say, while it does present a benign face in these scientific, environmental, and other fora, and does take seriously the environmental problems, the positions and assets that it gains from it can also be used against us. And I think it's good that the NATO countries are aware of that and take that into account. But I think maybe a little bit more is needed, especially on the space and cyber front.
Ambassador Hutchinson.
Yes, I would just say that we have a unique capability today to not having to catch up to see what China is doing after they've already done it. And I think our capability today is to begin to really put in place the standards. Secretary Pompeo said we should have the countries where China is now looking to try to get infrastructure, that we shouldn't be, and it's not our decision, but the decision of the countries allowing China to own property in those countries, because we have seen how they have taken a research position, an environmental position. China is not using its environmental position on its own coal production. It's saying it won't invest in other countries that aren't using environmental methods to take coal, but they're not talking about what they do. And I think we should be looking at the China's strategies of the past. Their strategies in the parts of the oceans and the parts of the world where they have their major interests. But look at their strategy there, and then look at where they are in the high north and with the capabilities that the global warming and the warming waters give them. And let's take the steps now rather than after they have gotten infrastructure, gotten property, gotten one of those military bases, set up their satellite system in that place. As you said, one building will do it. And oh, by the way, we even share with Russia all the things that we're doing in space, but China does not share anything. And they have even been known to blow up satellites in order to create debris that would harm our International Space Station. So it is so important that we take this opportunity, which I think we're doing, assess exactly where we are with the high north, and then put the assets in place to protect that with security. We don't have to be doing anything against China. We just need to protect what we have, facing a global change in the waters that now are navigable, will be navigable, where there are vast resources that could enhance our own energy capabilities and that of our allies. And let's do something that is proactive rather than reactive, as you mentioned, when the train has already left the station.
Excellent. Well, Mark Lantin from Reykjavik, we're going to give you the last word. Any comments that you have to Arthur's point, and maybe a question you might want to ask to our NATO Assistant Secretary General?
Okay, thank you. Excellent points that are being brought up here. Absolutely, China has very ambitious plans for the Arctic. And if I was giving this presentation 5 years ago, I could rattle off a very long list of Beijing's plans for various types of infrastructure, including the mines, various uses of the Northern Sea Route, as well as all kinds of port operations that were being discussed. In fact, some Chinese academics were referring to the Belt and Road as one belt, one road, and one circle, which really would seem to demonstrate that Beijing, back about 5 years ago, had very ambitious plans for the Arctic. But it goes back to what I said before about capabilities versus preferences. Now, China definitely has quite a few preferences what it would like to see in the Arctic in regards to its economic and strategic interests, but its capabilities are a completely different story. And I argued in a paper a few years ago that to describe what China's seeking to do in the region, it's not necessarily a case of revisionism. It's a question of China trying to be almost a norm entrepreneur, to kind of bring forward the idea that the Arctic should be treated as an international space, that it is simply too complex a region on a variety of fronts to be administered simply by 8 governments. And this has been something which China has been putting forward for quite some time. But in light of recent events, in light of the setbacks that China has experienced in many parts of the Arctic, even Beijing's ability to be a norm entrepreneur has become reduced. So I would say that the question here is that with China coming to the realization that its kind of windows, its openings to the Arctic are few and far between, much less than was originally expected, should we consider a different change, like a change of approach on Beijing's part? One which certainly will keep Russia in mind, but also one which would seem to suggest that China would still like to see the Arctic be open to various areas of Chinese diplomacy, and that for the Arctic to be militarized or for the Arctic to be cut in half or cut into various pieces doesn't necessarily serve Chinese interests. And one more point, I would say again, looking at what happens after the Party Congress is going to be very key, because I do predict that we are going to be seeing some very interesting shifts in Chinese foreign policy as a whole. Thanks.
Excellent. Good. Well, thank you. I thank our panelists. I think we'll take a short break and set up for the next panel.
How do you turn it on here?
I think he's going to turn it on automatically for us, he said.
Point it at
That's
the
great.
computer.
They don't have to worry about it.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome back. I'm Arthur Herman, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute, and I'm glad you're able to join us now for our second panel in discussing our topic of how to deal with China's ambitions and China's strategic and economic presence in the Arctic region. As I mentioned in one of my comments from the first panel, ably organized and run by my co-host, Rosalind Layton of the China Tech Threat, that the idea of behind strategy, in my mind, is always about matching ends to means. And what we want to do now, we've been talking about sort of the broader implications of what is happening with regard to China's ambitions in the Arctic region. Now maybe we'll have some time to talk about the means. In other words, what are the ways in which the U.S. and its allies can deal with and implement policies that will be helpful in helping to make whatever presence China is going to have in the Arctic, and it seems from our first panel that that's inevitable, to make sure that that presence is as constructive and as consonant with the aims of the community of nations as it can be. So for our discussion now in our second panel, we've put together a fresh set of expert eyes and knowledge about the area, drawn from a diverse range of experiences that go with being involved in Arctic policy and in dealing with what's happening in that part of the world and the implications, both strategic and economic, for what unfolds in that part of the world. And so I'm very pleased that we have with us, to read from left to right, my left to right, we have Professor David Wright from the University of Calgary, who is one of the leading experts about Chinese military history, as well as about China's current military ambitions around the world, including in the Arctic. We have Kure Christensen, who is CEO and co-founder of Odense Maritime Technology, who has a strong background in engineering and who knows a great deal about the maritime resources and shipbuilding resources that are necessary for cooperation with U.S. and its allies in the Arctic region, as well as understanding China's potential interest in the maritime industry in the region. And then we are also privileged to have the Honorable Carla Sands, former U.S. ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark, who has recently joined the America First Policy Institute and is vice chair of their section on energy and
The environment.
energy and environment. Obviously, as we saw from the first panel, very relevant concerns when it comes to what's going to happen in a rapidly changing and transforming Arctic region as well. So without more introduction from me to this, what I want to do is then turn the discussion over to our panelists. And David, would you like to start for us?
Since immigrating to Canada from the United States in 1999, I have clued in on how emotionally and symbolically Canadians are attached to the Arctic. It is an enormous part of who they are, even if the vast majority of them have never been there and never intend to go. It seems that for them, the massive Canadian shield and the Arctic Ocean beyond it are anchor points for their very existence and identity. Canada's northern strategy emphasizes the country's deeply ingrained historical relationship to the north and the important role the Arctic plays in forging the Canadian identity. Indeed, Canada's Arctic messaging has always emphasized Canada's inherently northern character, creating an emotional and almost mythological connection to the North, helping them to cement their identity as the most authentically true Arctic nation. Margaret Atwood, Canada's literary titan, has completed 17 cruises to the Arctic, and she always gets off the cruise ships and hikes around on land. She is very drawn to the Arctic and does not seem to know exactly why. Says she, quote, "When you love something, you just love it, and it doesn't require any more explanation than that," end quote. Between writing projects, she and her naturalist husband travel the world, and what she calls her Arctic inspirations are a very large part of her literary wanderlust. Global Affairs Canada, for its part, says on its official government website that, quote, "The Arctic is central to Canada's national identity, prosperity, security, values, and interests," quote. And Canadians can get defensive about their beloved Arctic. Many Canadians do not take kindly to any challenge to Canada's sovereignty over the Northwest Passage, for instance, be they from the US, the EU, or more recently from China. China's recent interests and activities in the Arctic make many Canadians uneasy, even if they are unsure of exactly how to deal with that unease. Is the panda bear now eyeing the polar bear's territory and prerogatives in the Arctic? To be sure, many Canadians see China as an interloper and Johnny-come-lately in Arctic affairs. Equally certain is that the feelings of the Canadian public towards China have soured in recent years. In 2019, before the pandemic, a survey conducted at the University of British Columbia indicated that China was viewed positively by only 29% of Canadians. By the spring of 2020, that percentage had dropped precipitously, with an Angus Reid study indicating that now only 14% of adults in Canada had a positive opinion of China. A survey from 2020 shows that even a majority of Chinese Canadians themselves say that the government of mainland China cannot be trusted. But it is important to note that Canada's bad feelings about China do not stem primarily from China's Arctic interests and ambitions. In late 2018, the CCP imprisoned two Canadian citizens, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, the two Michaels. Michael Spavor is a Calgarian and has been a close personal friend of mine since 2004. In November of 2018, he lectured on North Korea to the students in my Modern East Asia History course at the University of Calgary, and the next month he returned to China, where he was nabbed on December 10th, International Human Rights Day. I worried about that man for 1,000 days before he finally made it back home to Canada and Calgary in late September 2021. His detention and that of Michael Kovrig have dogged Canada-China relations ever since. So is Canada all wrought up right now about China and the Arctic? By and large, I would say no. I would say that at present, the Canadian public seems to find China's Arctic ambitions irksome and presumptuous, but not alarming or ominous. In general, Canadian hawks are few and far between, and Canada longs to be everyone's friend. But its recent experiences with China show that that is not always possible. In Canada, there is a robust debate going on about China in the Arctic, with the hawk being Rob Hubert of the University of Calgary, and the doves being Whitney Lackenbauer, who was Hubert's PhD student at Annam La Jeunesse. And they are, after all, Canadians, so they are all good friends. China issued its Arctic policy in the form of a white paper in 2018, but this said very little, if anything, about its strategic ambitions and objectives. These strategic objectives seem to be under discussion and debate the way China's Arctic policy was until the issuance of the white paper. I published a paper in 2011 with the Naval War College chronicling the discussions and debates about China's Arctic policy. When it comes to Arctic strategy, I doubt that the discussion and the debate is going to be that public. In my research, I published in 2018 a piece with the Canada Global Affairs Institute called "The Dragon and Great Power Rivalry at the Top of the World, China's Hawkish Revisionist Voices Within Mainstream Discourse on Arctic Affairs." I don't have time to read aloud from those excerpts, but I will note that there are two particularly militarist voices among the broad range of discussion of Chinese strategy. One is named Yang Zhirong of the Naval Military Academy Research Institute, and another is Li Zhenfu of the Dalian Maritime University. Yang Zhirong in particular gets very specific about how someday China needs to completely dominate the Arctic. Because the Arctic being the top of the world, China and Chinese military assets would be in a very good position to deal with incoming threats, meaning mostly missiles, I think, from anywhere in the world. Now, these voices exist. I want to emphasize that they are not the majority. There are a lot of people who are talking about China's strategy in more peaceful terms. But these two militarist voices that I have identified, they are very much mainstream. They are not the Chinese equivalent of American crackpots like Alex Jones or Ted Nugent. They are mainstream in their approaches. So this kind of talk does exist in China to a certain extent. But in the short run to 2030, and the medium run midway through this century, it seems to me unlikely that anything like this will ever be achieved. Prior to 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PRC, there are enormous impediments and obstacles to the CCP's path to Arctic, let alone global domination. First, there is China's burgeoning demographic crisis. As China's population ages, China's ticking gray time bomb will see the ratio of working age people to retired elderly go dramatically out of balance to something like 3 working people for every retired person, with unprecedented burdens on the working population to maintain China's aged population. No public pension system in the world would be able to shoulder that burden. That's why China is currently offloading that task and responsibility to the children rather than to the government. It'll be interesting to see what this, how it plays itself out. That is, China may well grow old before it ever becomes wealthy and powerful enough to achieve Arctic, let alone global, domination. Current trends, which do not look amenable to dramatic improvement, suggest that by 2040, the Chinese population will be more skewed in favor of old people than Japan, the grayest major country in the world today. Second, a new RAND study indicates that China does not possess the means to mount effective long-distance expeditionary forces to the Arctic and likely will not for quite some time, perhaps not until 2049. A new article by Lackenbauer and La Jeunesse, one still hot off the press, argues persuasively that China is nowhere near being a peer competitor of any Arctic state in the Arctic, and that Beijing's ability to project military power into the Arctic is limited. Further, they point out that the Arctic may present an enticing opportunity for China to feign strategic interest and bait Arctic states to overinvest in or overcommit capabilities to that region rather than elsewhere in the world. The CCP will not divert military resources and attention away from Taiwan, but if it can use the Arctic to get the free and democratic world to divert its attention away from Taiwan and towards the Arctic, then perhaps it will do just that. This would follow Sun Tzu's ideas about doing no battle yet suppressing the enemy's forces. Chinese military history is replete with things like feint, ruse, stratagem, and especially deceit. Third, China is encountering real-world impediments and setbacks to some of its Arctic plans and ambitions. Think Iceland, Greenland, and Canada, and what's been going on there. China is now somewhat constrained by various factors and considerations, including but not limited to capabilities, legal issues, politics, and public relations. Fourth, La Jeunesse and Choi of the University of Calgary call into question the usefulness, practicality, and strategic value of Chinese submarine deployment in the Arctic, maintaining that the US and Russia can effectively control the Bering Strait choke point and that strait contains US listening systems and is within easy range of anti-submarine assets, and that for China, from the Aleutians to French Polynesia, There are tens of millions of square kilometers of deep water in which to hide, all a safer bet than the Arctic. Fifth, right now and into the foreseeable future, China has more important regional fish to fry. The CCP's top priority is, of course, the annexation of Taiwan. After that, its appetite will not be sated, and it may go after what it sees as more lost historical territory, whether Mongolia or the Senkaku Islands, or even territory lost to Tsarist Russia in the 19th century. If Arctic domination is, in fact, on the CCP's list, it is likely way down on the list in the long term. And even then, China might not want global domination or even Arctic domination after all, but regional domination of the Asia-Pacific all the way to the international dateline. In other words, it could be that John Mearsheimer is right about regional hegemonies. Over the long run, however, all bets are indeed off, and by long run I mean post-2049. Anne-Marie Brady has shown that China does seem quite convinced that being a major world power will eventually include being influential in Arctic affairs. And if China does have ambitions to achieve global domination, domination of the Arctic will eventually be essential. Within the CCP, advocates of achieving Arctic and global domination may well have realized that it cannot achieve these ambitions in the short and medium terms, but they will likely defer these ambitions rather than abandoning them. One of China's great virtues is quiet, enduring, and determined patience. China has a long history of planning and deferring over the long haul. Michael Pillsbury's 2016 book, The 100-Year Marathon, drew criticism from academics, some academics, because the reviewers doubted that any polity or government could surreptitiously pursue a coherent set of national objectives over very long periods of time. But in Chinese antiquity, the state of Qin did essentially that. The Qin, one of many culturally and linguistically Chinese states, patiently bided its time, quietly strengthened its economy and military, and doggedly operated extensive espionage networks in rival states for many centuries, until finally emerging triumphant and unifying all of culturally Chinese regions under its centralized and imperial control in 221 BC. Regarding the Arctic, in 1925, a warlord government in China acceded to the Svalbard Treaty, and then after that, China paid essentially no attention to the Arctic until the 21st century. Chinese and Russian domination of the Arctic are a very concerning possibility, one that bears considerable precaution and careful surveillance. I have my doubts about this domination actually being achieved within the lifetime of my children, but it could turn out that my grandchildren's generation may have cause for great concern as they run with a torch handed off to them by the free and democratic world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. So my points about China and the Arctic are primarily related to my work as CEO in OMT. We is a Danish company that design both Navy and commercial ships, and that includes vessels for the Arctic. In this capacity, I have had first-hand experience with building ships in China, and quite some experience with the Chinese shipbuilding industry, and also with the type of vessels that would be required if you want to have power in the Arctic. So I will address my topic in 2 steps. First, I will share with you my experience with the Chinese shipbuilding industry and where it is, and then basically ask the question, if China decides to do it, could they out-compete us in the Arctic? Can I have the that one? Thank you. Oh, we swapped the presentations, I think.
Can we put his up?
Anyway, I will, here we go.
Now we do is aim to here to get your signal.
Signal. Please go. Just, yeah, just flip. Oh. Can you flip slides in there? Doesn't matter. I will just do it without. But before I start, I'll just give you a few words on who OMT is and what we do. So basically, OMT is a spin-off from the A.P. Møller-Mærsk shipyard in Denmark. A.P. Møller-Mærsk is the biggest shipping company in the world. We have practiced ship design and shipbuilding for quite a decade. We were building container ships, and at the same time, we were building frigates for the Royal Danish Navy. And we did it quite efficiently. We could spit out these ships every 3 months. That included the frigates. Now, we have built now more than 170 ships in China under license. And that includes container ships that has been ice-classed. I had a picture of the Venta Maersk. Is a ship we have designed. It was en route on the North Passage just for testing how that business will look like. But Maersk decided that that's not a good business right now to take the container ships up north. Now, after 170 ships in China, we found out that it was not really the long-term strategy for China to buy designs in Europe. Actually, China wanted it to do themselves. So it was very hard for us to protect the IPR. So we basically decided to abandon China and focus on defense instead. And in that role, we got the task to design the Canadian offshore patrol vessels, the Arctic ships that Canada is investing in. And we started to market the Danish frigate, not just the design, but also the manufacturing concept that was behind that 3 months building tact. So now there's 16 frigates under construction in 4 countries that would like to learn a little bit more about that building tact, and that includes UK. Now, back to Chinese shipbuilding. Chinese shipbuilding has developed really significantly in the last decade, and they have quietly become the absolutely world champion in shipbuilding. Now, the world's cargo fleet, if you take a look at that, in this sector, already by 1918, China designed more than 52 of the ships that came out that year. They were designed by China, not just manufactured. They manufactured 56% of these ships. They financed 59%, and they operated 29% back in 2018. These numbers has increased ever since. So China has become a superpower in design, in building, in financing, and operating ships. China, Korea, and Japan is still in, but they are really being challenged to remain competitive. Now, what has that to do with the topic today? Well, the question is, how can that maritime power potentially be projected into the Arctic? In 2019, the Chinese government basically decided to fuel that development in creating really strong maritime shipbuilding companies by merging 2 of the biggest state-owned shipyards in China. Now, their own assessment of that was that would create a super shipyard group with more than 300,000 employees in it, but it will also be that kind of companies that could create or make the Chinese Navy very, very powerful and to build a very big Navy. And they have done exactly that. I had a picture of one of the state-owned shipyards. They are spitting out container ships and frigates and destroyers on the same shipyard. Now, it was our experience. I'm up. That's the one. So on this picture, you basically see container ships, a little bit hard to see. I have a better picture, but very, very high output. Something similar to what we did in Denmark, a ship every 3 months, and they're being spitted out. Next one. Now, why is that interesting? Because when you do this kind of ecosystem, or basically bundle Navy shipbuilding and commercial shipping, you create a very, very strong ecosystem that should not be underestimated. Now, you basically practice how to design ships quickly, and you practice how to adopt new technology on ships. You do that in the commercial domain. And then you reuse these skills when you build the Navy ships. That's what's really powerful behind this concept. Now, this picture is old, but I think we should remember it. It's back from the Second World War. At that time, US had that manufacturing capacity that could basically outproduce Germany under Second World War, and US did. So Roosevelt called this the arsenal of democracy. Mm-hmm. Now, in 2022, this capacity is not in the US anymore. This capacity is now residing in China. And so this arsenal of democracy is no longer here. It's in China. And now we have to call it something else. It's no longer an arsenal of democracy. It's something different. Now, what has that to do? With the Arctics? Will China use this capability tomorrow or in 49 or whenever? Now, they already have designed some these icebreakers, and they're planning to build some more for the China's Polar Silk Road. But will China only build icebreakers? Now, could any of these frigates here, could they actually quietly be polar frigates? It's hard to know. And now I will give you a little insight in ship design. And I've taken the Danish frigate as an example. Now, to the left, that's a general purpose frigate. That's the original Iver Huitfeldt class frigates. Standard hull, no ice breaking. And then we've just added, in the left picture, you can't really see the difference, but the difference is 110 tons of steel added the right places, very cheap. Steel is $1,000 for 1 ton of steel, so not really expensive. And that turns that ship into a polar frigate, more or less. 110 tons of steel, and you can't even see the difference. Then we'll have some winterization packages. You need to de-ice things if you want to operate in the Arctic. Don't underestimate that. That will be the ice accretion on ships operating in the Arctic, but you can't see that under the hood either if you're doing that. I'm from the country of Lego, and I learned from child the value of reconfiguration and modularization. So just take another look on these two ships, because that could also play a role. To the left, that's one of our latest design. It's an NPV 80 Polar Rescue, painted white, search and rescue on the side. It has 32 container positions where you can plug in various modules. In the left, there are search and rescue modules, search drones, firefighting things, and other things you need to do search and rescue. To the right, the exact same ship, this time painted gray, still 32 container position, but this time fitted with missiles, guns, and accommodating drones on on the flex deck on this ship. So a completely different purpose for that ship. Now, could these ships be relevant in the Arctic? We talk a lot about these icebreakers. Icebreakers are needed if you want to tour the North Pole, but in many of the areas, you really don't need a full-blown icebreaker to do business. We talk a lot about the geo gap. In the western part of the geo gap, you don't need to break ice, but there will be ice patches in the water, so you need to protect your hull against these ice patches. Otherwise, you can't do business there all year round. In the eastern part of the geo gap, there's very little ice, so that might be the reason why Norwegians don't have ships that are ice-classed. Now, I don't know if these frigates in the Xinjiang shipyard, whether they are polar frigates or not. We could bet on it, but my point is that if they are, then somebody in NATO needs to start thinking about whether we should add 110 tons of steel in some of our designs. Because right now, we have 4 ships up there that are ice-class. That's the Thetis class. Great ships, but they're 31-year-old. They are about to be retired after a long life in the North Atlantic, and there's no decision yet in Denmark to replace them. So my final remark here is if NATO wants to have ship in the North Atlantic, we better start acting and planning where and why we should put the 110 tons of steel into the ship, just to be safe.
Here we go. So my name is Carla Sands. I was the U.S. ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark. That's Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands from 2017 until 2021. And while I served there, I was briefed at our National Science Foundation here in Washington. And they created a map that I discovered hanging on the wall. And this is the map of the Arctic. They actually had the Antarctic, and I said, "Do you have one of the Arctic that I can see?" And they did. And when I saw this, and I saw the point of view from the North Pole, and we know this is how the PRC military and Chinese leadership look at the Arctic, I said, "Can I get more copies?" So let me just orient you, because not a lot of us look at the Arctic this way. I'm just going to stand for a second. From right here until this entire coastline to the border of Finland, that is Russia's coast, and that is Russia in the Arctic. And Russia is militarized, unlike any of these other coasts, with new points of militarization, and they've reopened and refurbished old Cold War bases. This very busy coast. Then we have Finland, which has just joined, is joining NATO. Sweden, both have capabilities. We have Norway. Down here is Denmark. So my region was down here, Denmark. The Faroe Islands, which is just north of Scotland and the UK. Here's the Shetland Islands. Here's Iceland. And here's Greenland, shaped like a keyhole. And so we were in Denmark. Here's the GI-UK gap, Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. And this is the region that we dealt with while I was working with my team. Then we have Canada, and the United States of Alaska is there at about 9 to 10 o'clock on the map. So this is the region that we're talking about today, and China. And why is this significant? Because in the United States, most of us just don't pay attention to the Arctic, and we don't really have a great understanding of the region. It's not on most people's radar. So when I began to talk about my concerns about China's presence here in Faroe Islands, even in Denmark, and certainly in Greenland in 2018, I was met with closed doors and no at the Department of Defense, the State Department, and the White House, everywhere else, Commerce, Trade, USTR. So I got the copies of this map and actually rolled them up and put a red bow around them. And I took with me a book about the Arctic that I found in Greenland, about the US military occupation of Greenland during World War II. And I took it to the White House, the Pentagon, secretaries, assistant secretaries, all the way down, about 4 or 5 deep, because those folks write the policy papers, and began to talk about the region. Because I was briefed while I went through ambassador school by the State Department and various departments and agencies, and that's how I learned. And if no one tells you, you're not aware of the challenges. So my team and I focused on resilience against Russia and China most especially, because especially in Greenland, we saw the economic opportunities that China was attempting to insert themselves in, and then we saw the Russian military activity in the region. I'll just give you another example. In the Faroe Islands, they had many military ship visits from Russia, but the United States Navy hadn't visited the Faroe Islands for 30 years. So I was able to ask the number 2 at the Navy, do you think we could get a ship visit to the Faroe Islands? And it was yes. So now we have that cooperation. And we saw that Russia does a lot more trade with the Faroe Islands than the US, for instance. China does a lot more trade with Greenland than the US does, at least by the time I left in 2021. So China has a minority interest in a majority of the mines in Greenland, and Greenland is rich in rare earth minerals. And we know we need those for our cell phones, military equipment, electric car batteries. And so, let me see if I can go to the next slide. So there are challenging conditions here in the high north. And my number 1 goal when I went through ambassador school, they ask you to make your goals, was open a consulate in Greenland. We hadn't had diplomatic relationship for 67 years. So you begin to gather information, right? And we found that this is how we got around on the ice sheets, was on sledges that are pulled by motorized vehicles, kind of like a snow machine. And you can see here's the edge of the ice sheet. It's cold. And so there are also challenging conditions on the ocean. You were talking about this. The US has 2, one doesn't work all the time, icebreakers. Russia has 40, and some of them have missiles on them. So it's a very different. China now has, like you were talking about, a bigger navy than the US has at this time. US has the smallest navy we've had since World War I. And so we are being we are being outspent and achieved in some areas that if we want to be competitive, we have to look at. So we need to know what's above the water, on the water, and under the water. And China has a habit of, Russia too, turning off their transponders. This is all open source. We get Chinese fishing vessels where they're not supposed to be, illegally fishing out the waters. And then we have not just illegally fishing, but also using their fishing craft as military vessels. Another trick. So there we go. So we also have the ice melt. And so we have more ice growing in some areas, less ice in other areas. Different years, it's different. But there's a chalky kind of silt that comes off of the ice sheet and the icebergs. And it's a fascinating area, kind of like the moon, if you ever want to get up there. Then we have the Summit Station, the U.S. National Science Foundation in cooperation with universities, up on the ice sheet. If you remember the map, and the keyhole-shaped Greenland, kind of in the middle. And the circumstances are extreme. We have Thule Air Base, which is in the northwest of Greenland. It's above the North Pole. It's the U.S. government's most northern base, Thule Air Base, and it's actually part of Space Force now because of the new Space Force. And you can see the conditions are pretty stark. This is the harbor, so it's not clear all that often. the conditions for the fighting force. When the U.S. did high north exercises, our military found that our men and women really weren't prepared for the cold. The cold's different than Alaska or Aspen. This is special cold. And so you can see some of the special gear, how the Danish ships up in Greenland bring the smaller ships into the belly of the ship because the waters are so extreme. Our military has had trouble navigating these high north waters. They are very challenging and we are not prepared. And then we travel on the very high north on C-130s on skis. And they need 8 props, not 4, because the air is so thin and cold. It's hard to get lift and loft. A funny story, so when we prepare to go to the high north, they had sorel boots, and those are good boots for cold weather. Well, I had my own. I thought I liked to wear my own boots, not their boots. What I didn't know is mine were aspen sorels. And when you go to the Arctic, you need like Arctic sorels. And so the cold just radiates from those miles of ice sheets into your bones. And so note, always use the right gear when you're going out. I should have known as a Girl Scout. Okay. So here we are. So NATO does cold weather exercises. They did one up off the coast of Norway a few years ago called Trident Juncture. They work in Poland because many European countries don't get that cold. So in some of the extreme conditions. And so it was good to be with the troops but understanding we're not doing enough high north exercise. If you look at what Russia does, and of course they're flexing, and one of you mentioned, about China, with the feint. Well, I don't think Russia's feinting. I think they're actually flexing about their capabilities in the high north. And I think that we must be prepared.